good afternoon. It's Monday, the 6th of August, 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me today, Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire. Welcome to the programme once again, Patrick.
Great to be with you, Mike.
Okay, we're going to get straight on with Brexit and another day more nonsense about Brexit in the mainstream media. David Davis apparently saying that the UK government does not want no deal, but it's certainly not going to be pushed around by the European Parliament. We haven't seen any evidence of that so far, but anyway, at least to clarify, we've seen lots of evidence that they are willing to be pushed around by the European Parliament. It staggers me just how much nonsense there is in the press about the fact that Britain is, or the suggestion that Britain is being held to ransom by the EU, that the EU's got the upper hand here, when in fact we've got this massive trade deficit running, and it's much more important for them to make a proper deal with us rather than the other way around. So this is just more fake news in the press. Of course, who do they roll out to ask for some comment from? David Davis, who of course only a week or two ago said that he had quit. So this discussion goes on. Barnier says one thing. David Davis, who isn't even part of the process anymore, says another thing. It's nonsense. In the meantime, the Brexit without the exit keeps going on. And this is information from the Marine Management Organisation, who are providing advance notice of changes to fishery laws it expects will affect the English/UK fishing industry throughout 2019. Now, the Marine Management Organisation has a remit which includes enforcing EU and UK fisheries regulations in English waters, and it provides insight into its work in order to give industry as much certainty as possible and to help them prepare for changes. Now, one of the biggest changes, Patrick, you would expect would be Brexit. And many people in the fishing industry, I would imagine, hoping that Brexit is going to make some positive difference to their lives. But no, absolutely not, because in fact, although the Marine Management Organisation is there to help people prepare for changes, in fact, in this case, they're preparing for no change whatsoever, because what they're saying is that UK fishermen will still need to comply with EU changes that are coming in during 2019, despite the UK leaving the EU. This is because the government will be bringing EU rules into UK law as retained EU law, and so existing fisheries arrangements will continue to operate in the period following the UK leaving the EU. So once again, Brexit without the exit.
The proof's right there, Mike, but I'm going to unveil I have a solution for the UK government. So you noted, Mike, that there's a trade deficit between Britain and the EU. So one would think that who would have the upper hand in that negotiations? Well, I think that Theresa May should delegate the negotiations to Donald Trump, because Donald Trump will probably get a better deal.
It's quite possible.
It's getting that bad. Why not? Go call the White House and see if you can lend a hand.
Yeah. Well, Theresa May and her Tory party are crowing today that they have brought in an opt-out for organ and tissue donation. This is going to save lives. Now, I just want to highlight an article on the UK Column website, which I've put back onto the front page again. No Time to Die. It was published by Dr. Mike Williams written by Dr. Mike Williams, rather, in January this year. Now, the government press release says that there's going to be a new system of consent for organ and tissue donation announced. Hundreds of lives will be saved each year under plans to change the law to a new system of consent. The government has outlined plans to implement this new system to tackle shortage of donors. This will mean everyone is considered an organ donor unless they've explicitly recorded a wish not to be, or they're from one of the excluded groups. And the excluded groups are children under 18, individuals who lack the mental capacity to understand the changes, people who've not lived in England for at least 12 months, before their death. And the donor register, they say, will include an option for individuals to state important religious and cultural beliefs to ensure these are respected. There will also be strict safeguards in place, and specialist nurses will always discuss donation with families so individuals' wishes are respected. So we warned in January that there was a consultation started on this. This is the result of it. And this article really is there to try to address the issue of informed consent, because the question is, when are you in fact dead? are organs removed from a dead body, or in fact, are you kept alive while the organs are removed? And if you are kept alive, what are the circumstances under which you're kept alive? Is there any anesthesia used, for example? So there are many questions, and I strongly suggest rather that everybody should read this article before they make this decision. Just to give a bit of the conclusion that Mike Williams wrote here, he said, whether you agree or not with the definition and method of proving death, and whether or not you're persuaded that there is significant evidence that some donors may not in fact be dead and may still experience pain upon dissection for removal of organs, and whether or not you believe that financial interests may impact the decision to remove organs or preserve life, the decision to donate your organs is yours and yours alone, and that decision must include all available information regarding organ donation. It's not for the government or anyone else to make that decision for you, and it's not up to them to withhold information that may affect your decision. In fact, according to the Montgomery ruling, it is unlawful to do so. He raises the issue of financial returns for people involved in the organ trade. And we'll just bring this one back on screen from last Thursday's UK column news. This is from the Times. Doctored lungs for pigs could cut transplant waiting lists. And they're talking about lungs being grown in the lab, but making the point that this can't be done. It still relies on donations from human beings. And so, I mean, something that Mike Williams doesn't mention in his article, but which occurs to me, Patrick, is that, part of informed consent is informed consent about how many organs that are donated go directly to a patient that needs them, and how many organs or tissue that's donated ends up going to so-called scientific research.
And what do you think the answer to that is, Mike?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, and I think that's a major part of the problem.
Do you think it comes down to who's paying the most? Do you think that factors into that equation?
I think it's very likely to factor into that equation, absolutely.
In that case, you have a number of serious ethical and moral issues which are arising out of this. So whether that takes any precedent in this debate at a government level or a corporate level, that's going to be really up to people to get informed on the issue and make sure that that's up at the top of the agenda. Because if you leave it to government and corporations, I guarantee you it's going to be at the bottom. Absolutely.
Right, let's move abroad now and to Syria, Patrick. And here we go, Bana 2, the sequel, because this is Hala. Another 6-year-old girl has appeared on Twitter. Well, we have a little bit of video here just to give you an impression of Hala. So let's have a look at this.
My name's Hannah. I am 6 years old.
So that's just a short little video clip that appeared on her Twitter feed. Apparently she is 6 years old. She's running her own Twitter account. And as you heard from the video, her English is very good. So I'm being slightly sarcastic there. She's been taught a few words, but apparently is able to tweet in English and understand how to retweet and all these kinds of things. This is Bana version 2, Patrick.
It is. It's really, what is the age limit for having a Twitter account, by the way? Is it?
It's supposed to be 13.
According to their terms and conditions. So how then could a 6-year-old girl run a Twitter account? So this is another bogus propaganda construct. Hala of Idlib, holding court in the de facto remaining Islamic State in Syria, is being occupied at the moment and run by al-Qaeda and al-Qaeda affiliates, and holding a lot of residents there hostage. And there you can see the shameless rebels using children in order to egg on some kind of a Western intervention. It failed in Aleppo miserably, but yet Bana still secured a multi-million-dollar contract thanks to J.K. Rowling and the Blair Partnership, Simon & Schuster, and she's being feted around like a exhibit from a museum around pushing the narrative on Syria. Are they going to get away with it with this latest one? Probably not. I have a feeling, Mike, it's just going to fall flat on its face.
Well, interestingly enough, Patrick, the 12th person apparently to follow this account was none other than Nader, who is apparently a BBC journalist. So BBC getting right in there, almost immediately, pretty quick. You've got to ask, just how did they discover this little girl so quickly?
It's because they're so good, Mike. The BBC are just that good. That they've got their finger right on the pulse, and he must be following BBC trending every day with Mike Wendling, and that's why he's so switched on. I don't think they have anything to do with this little propaganda operation.
No,
the BBC would never do that, nor would anybody affiliated with BBC Media Action.
Well,
they simply wouldn't do that, Mike.
You're just preempting this just a little bit. Now, if anybody is particularly observant, they will notice that in the bottom left-hand side of that graphic on screen, we've got a couple of Twitter accounts which are related to the Twitter accounts that I follow that are following this account. And indeed, there is BBC Media Action at the bottom left there, following Mr. Nader.
Oh, you have to be kidding me.
So
I didn't know that. I was just making a joke, Mike. And
no,
there
well,
it is.
Unfortunately, there it is, Patrick. So this person clearly linked to BBC Media Action in some way. Or at least BBC Media Action is following his work.
Yes, so now we can see a few parts of the propaganda ring fence right there. So
now, if anybody is new to the program and doesn't understand what we're talking about here with regard to BBC Media Action, go to the UK Column website and have a search for BBC Media Action. You'll come across an article on their activities. This is a charity which is supposedly independent from the BBC. They share their pension fund. They're funded through the BBC, but they're supposed to be independent. And what they do is they provide training for journalists in foreign countries. This is British Foreign Office soft power at work. And BBC Media Action have admitted, in fact bragged about the fact that they put their journalists into Syria in 2004 with a view to identifying members of the Syrian government who could be activated as opposition. And they worked to generate that opposition, create that opposition within Syria. And the point that we have made in the past is this is a fantastic business model for the BBC, because they send this organization into a country, they destabilize the country, they create a civil war in inverted commas, and then they go and report on the civil war, and this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, really.
And if you can sell a few Typhoon jets in the process, even better.
Even better, even better. Now let's move on to the white helmets, Patrick, because well, Vanessa Beeley pulled off a bit of a coup over the weekend, because, well, really it was RT and going underground managed to get Raed Saleh, the head of the white helmets, on for an interview. And Vanessa got the opportunity to respond to that interview. What were your thoughts?
A fantastic job by, RT did brilliantly. Afshin Rattanzi is a skilled and well-rounded international journalist and commentator, and he brought in the head of the White Helmets, Mike, and gave him equal time to Vanessa Beeley. Fantastic job by RT. And it really, Mike, makes the BBC look really bad, because they tried to slander Vanessa Beeley live on the BBC, one of their main flagship programs. So if RT is going to give equal time to Raed Saleh and Vanessa Beeley, why is the BBC not had any critics of the White Helmets on their network? Now, how many years has it been now? 4 years or something like that. So, it's laughable that Ofcom is enforcing any sort of broadcast rules according to their rule book, but yet they put a lot of pressure on RT. And now we know that's just political pressure, because they don't like the content which is being produced on RT, because it challenges the official government narrative. And also it's exposing corruption and things that the government would much rather cover up, Mike. And we're not just talking hyperbolically here. You have submitted a number of Freedom of Information requests into the Foreign Office regarding this expenditures and audited expenditures of the White Helmets. In other words, where's the 150 million in taxpayer money going, spent on what? Just uniforms, bumper stickers, and what else? And volunteers who actually get paid a salary, but a very small salary in comparison to the amount of money that's gone into their coffers. So, Mike, these are serious questions.
Absolutely serious questions, and the Foreign Office doesn't want to answer them. They're quite happy to admit, and haven't really got any choice, but to admit how much money has been spent. But to date, we don't know what this money's been spent on. They've tried to use a number of excuses, for example, commercial exemptions to the Freedom of Information Act for refusing to give this information. We know from a parliamentary question that the white helmets are obliged to provide a quarterly financial statement, which explains exactly how that money's been spent, but nobody is allowed to see that. That is considered top secret, it seems.
If you just go back to that article in 21 Wire, Mike, if you go to this article right now, I encourage people, there is a FOIA document we've republished on this article. The question was specific. The question was, is there any documentation of the white helmets, any of the 115,000 lives they claim to have saved since late 2013? Is there any information about that? Any accident reports, anything at all? And of course, the government's responses, we published it right there. Government's responses, actually, we don't have access to any of that. We don't require that. We're working with middlemen who are supposed to be overseeing that sort of thing, contractors or whatnot. So, we don't actually have any of that documentation. So in other words, the government doesn't care how the money's being spent, or the government doesn't care if these figures are correct or not. In other words, it's just a really big number. We've saved 115,000 lives since 2014 or whatever. So it's just ridiculous on its face.
Okay, let's move on to Yemen, Patrick. And this is Associated Press saying, and the headline is, Yemen, US allies don't defeat al-Qaeda but pay it to go away. And they say, again and again over the past 2 years, a military coalition led by Saudi Arabia has backed by the United States has claimed it won decisive victories that drove al-Qaeda militants from their strongholds across Yemen and shattered their ability to attack the West. Here's what the victors did not disclose. Many of their conquests came without firing a shot. That's because the coalition cut secret deals with al-Qaeda fighters, paying some to leave key cities and towns and letting others retreat with weapons, equipment and wads of looted cash. An investigation by the Associated Press has found hundreds more were recruited to join the coalition itself. These compromises and alliances have allowed al-Qaeda militants to survive to fight another day and risk strengthening the most dangerous branch of the terror network that carried out the 9/11 attacks. Key participants in the pacts said the US was aware of the arrangements and held off any drone strikes. And they go on to suggest that really this was an unintended consequence of the coalition and fighting with the coalition. When in fact, and they even suggested that in fact, the US always had the aim of eliminating the branch of extremists known as al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula or ACAP. Patrick, I don't know how many of these types of articles have to come out before people get the message. And I'll just highlight the Moon of Alabama article here from 2015. Which is entitled Yemen, Saudis to Arm Popular Committees, aka al-Qaeda. And so, the point that Moon of Alabama was making 3 years ago was that it was exactly this, the US-Saudi coalition arming al-Qaeda. This is very much exactly what has been going on in Syria.
This is exactly what's going on. And so how it's spun in the media is, oh, this is a cock-up. Unintended consequences. Oh, dear me, it's just all gone horribly wrong. We're not covering anything up. It's just a cock-up. And this is generally how the mainstream media and government collude together in order to sweep up any inconvenient problems. And the truth of the matter is actually exposed in the subtext of this story in the AP, which is that the United States and Saudi Arabia run al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And they have done for a very long time. And we just showed you 2 data points that more or less prove that, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. If you really want to do research on this, it's obvious. So if it's obvious to somebody with a spare hour to do some cursory research, why is this somehow a mystery or some sort of esoteric rocket science for mainstream media? Why is this not newsworthy for The Guardian? Instead, they're running Russian conspiracy theory stories this week. So that's the state of our mainstream press.
Well, we're going to come on to that in 1 second, but just before we do, let's mention Iran and Mike Pompeo here saying that the US is going to enforce sanctions against Iran. This is quite an interesting story because it actually affects Europe pretty strongly. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said yesterday that the United States would enforce the sanctions it is reimposing against Iran after Trump pulled out of the 2015 nuclear deal. And he was asked if Iran would be able to evade these sanctions, and he said that the United States was going to enforce the sanctions. He said that if Iran, putting pressure on Iran was meant to push back against Iranian malign activity. And he said that Iranians were unhappy with the failure of their own leadership to deliver the economic promises that their leadership promised them. He said the Iranian people are not happy, not with the Americans, but with their own leadership. This is just about Iranians' dissatisfaction with their own government. And this president is pretty clear. We want the Iranian people to have a strong voice in who their leadership would be. Is that a hint that they're looking at regime change? We'll talk about that in a second. But just before we do, I just want to mention the fact that in a sense, this is an attack, Patrick, on European countries and European businesses. Because the French in particular have been vocal about the fact that this puts their companies in a very difficult position because their companies have contracts with Iranian companies, but their companies also do business in the United States. So in fact, although the US has no direct leverage over French companies, for example, or German companies, the fact that those companies are doing business in the US leaves them open to being subject to US law. And therefore, at some point, they're going to have to break a contract because the US are forcing them to do so. So I wonder, is this part of the general pressure that the United States is putting on Europe at the moment with regard to military funding, for example, which they want, the US wants European countries to start putting much more money into funding. And of course, that money would find its way into US military industrial complex businesses.
Yes, it is happening at the same time, Mike, but this Mike Pompeo is using this tactic, Mike, because if you look back at history and when the United States has applied sanctions many, many times since the Second World War, the numbers do show that they're more likely to get compliance on secondary sanctions like this with allies. Because when an ally or an enemy, for that matter, believes that there's some future attack down the pipeline, they're much less likely actually to comply with sanctions. They're going to hunker down and dig their heels in. But with regards to U.S. allies, they've normally been allowed to get compliance with European partners and companies on this. So it's much cheaper for the French company, as you mentioned, to down tools and basically just withdraw and write off that section of the operation until a later date when it's maybe the business conditions are better. So I don't think there's a secondary motive with regards to Europe, Mike, but there is an effect there that of suffering by Europe, but I don't think that's what's driving the U.S. policy. I think they're just using any effective tools they can in order to achieve their foreign policy objectives on behalf of their clients and sponsors like Israel and Saudi Arabia, which is to bankrupt Iran and to force regime change and get a U.S. compliant government in power in Tehran. And that's not likely to happen, Mike, because Mike Pompeo is making an argument that actually is full of holes. Basically, he's blaming the Iran regime for not being able to deliver on economic promises after sanctions were lifted. So do you think you can turn around an economy in 2 years that has been strangled for the last 15, 20, or 30 years? That's not going to happen. And the reason they were strangled is because of U.S.-led sanctions on Iran. So Iranian people are not going to blame the regime. Mike Pompeo is spreading fake news, okay? The Iran people are going to blame, guess who? The United States for most of their problems. And if they reimpose sanctions, then you're going to see a strengthening of support for the regime in Tehran. So that will backfire. So Mike Pompeo's read half his history book. Yes, you can bully your European partners to comply with your whims on sanctions, yes, and European corporations. But he didn't read the last chapter of the book, which was that when you do apply punitive sanctions against a country, you're going to strengthen the support for the government. You're going to give the government a natural opt-out. They can now blame you for anything bad that happens in their economy, and that will increase their power base and make them more credible going forward. So actually, you're doing them a favor. So clearly, a man with a brain, that couldn't be the objective to oust the regime by tightening the noose on Iran. So I'm not saying that Mike Pompeo doesn't have a brain. I'm just saying that probably he's not well read on the subject enough to make some sort of an informed comment on this issue. So we'll see how it works out. Maybe Pompeo will prove us all wrong on this occasion after it's gone the same way on so many other occasions.
Okay, now let's move on to the Russian spy fake news in The Guardian then.
Well, this is interesting. So The Guardian, what's The Guardian doing? The Guardian's never been one to pass up a good Russian conspiracy theory story. Everybody knows that. So who runs The Guardian? Who's in charge of the editorial desk? Well, this was a little humdinger that they drifted out over the weekend, that somehow there was a Russian spy. I love the headline on the other article, which you don't have, Mike, but it's, oh yeah, revelations of suspected spy at U.S. Embassy in Moscow could be the tip of the iceberg. And this is from Dave Smith. This is our man in Washington, okay? So they've confirmed that there's a spy, but it's a suspected spy, but the headline's definitive. If you go down to read the body of both of these articles, you'll see that they're saying that, oh, this person must have knowledge of the DNC leaks and so forth. Well, it turns out, Mike, this is fake news. This is the most egregious form of propaganda. As it turns out, the person in question was Russian, but was employed by the Secret Service directly in an administrative capacity. But I think what The Guardian and the deep state were hoping was that just the idea that the United States employed a Russian in Russia, big scandal. It's going to cause huge embarrassment. They'll sack somebody, then they'll bury it, and then everyone will run for the exits. Well, that didn't happen. The Secret Service actually pushed back on this fake story by The Guardian and said, no, actually, this person's employed by us. They're very good. This is what they do. They've been employed for X number of years, and they're not exposed to any classified information or anything like that. So that would be embarrassing for any media outlet, Mike. But we live in times when there is no shame in the mainstream media.
So The Guardian even doubled down on the story by publishing follow-up stories on it?
Yeah, well, they just kind of tried to expand it. They hoped that it would create such a furor on CNN and on the sort of the hysterical wings of the U.S. media and possibly the BBC could pump this up to seem like a scandal that would force some resignation or something rather, and it just blew up in their face, Mike. So this is now on their rap sheet for one of the worst pieces of fake news. And by the way, this is actually a type of a story that's it's malicious because it can damage bilateral relations between the U.S. And Russia. You know, I might be over dramatizing a little bit and speculating, Mike, but one could say theoretically that a story like this could lead to some irrational reaction on the part of some bureaucrat in either country, and who knows, it could even cost a life in some cases. I'm not saying that it would in this one, but this type of activity by the mainstream media is hugely irresponsible, dangerous, unethical, and they should be dragged in front of a committee to explain why they produce such tripe from something that's not meant to be a red top. So it's just amazing, Mike.
Okay, well let's move back to the United States then, and this is Michael McFaul, who was tweeting out, there is no doubt that Russian intervention in 2016 changed a single vote. The only question remaining is, did Russian interference help to sway 78,000 votes in 3 states? Russian influence was marginal, but 2016 was won by Trump in the margins. Well, Tony Cartolucci tweeting out that further proof that this tweet constituted further proof that Russian meddling story is nonsense. Trump was expected to be blown out by Clinton. If Russia really wanted to meddle, their efforts wouldn't have been marginal. What's marginal is McFaul and the rest of the U.S. establishment's credibility.
It's right there. Great argument by Tony Cartolucci. If you go back to the previous tweet, Mike, you'll see at the bottom there, there was a troll.
Oh, yes.
A troll left a really good, some of these trolls are quite good. They leave some interesting comments. This one basically said that, he basically shamed Michael McFaul, saying that, so you're basically saying that people actually who bothered to get out and vote in the last election in the United States, that their vote didn't mean anything, and that really Russia somehow handed the victory to the winning presidential candidate. That's petty disenfranchisement, and that's a shameful thing to do for a representative of the United States. So I agree with that troll 100% on that point, Mike.
I would imagine you do, yes. Okay, well, sticking with Twitter then. Zero Hedge headline here is Twitter suspends Black conservative for changing New York Times bigots' tweets from white to Jewish and Black. Now, there's a number of issues here. First of all, Sarah Young, who apparently is joining the editorial board at the New York Times, has been tweeting this stuff out in the first place. Dumbass effing white people. Marking up well, I'm not even going to bother reading it, but really pretty obscene tweets. And the point that the so-called Black conservative was making was that if you change the term white people for Jewish people or Black people, that those tweets from this lady are pretty egregious racism. Now, is she Chinese or is she Korean, I think?
I'm not sure, but I'm not sure her background. But yeah, it's a Pacific Asian roots there. But yeah, so she's joined the New York Times board. If you read the whole thread of her tweets, Mike, it is really vile. So clearly, this is somebody that's got issues. Somebody who's preaching, as the establishment in America like to say, preaching hate. But she's not going to be censored, or she's not going to be reprimanded for that, because as long as she's preaching hate against one group and not another, then it's all okay, because it seems to be protected under the what one of my friends calls the narrowband narrative, the NBN. It seems to be protected under the NBN law of mainstream media physics. So, but Candace Owens is a female Black conservative. That's the same as being a Martian who just landed on Earth in the United States. And she makes a good point, Mike. She's making a very straight, simple, universalist argument that is reflected in basic, the golden rule, for instance, do unto others as they will do unto you. But those sort of traditional rules and views and ethics don't seem to apply in the new politics, where political correctness and being able to leverage certain angles on this to achieve political power or to ascend to certain levels within the system, like the New York Times, that seems to override any kind of ethics, any morals, or any basic sort of decency in this case. So I think she's making a great point.
But the bigger question here, Patrick, is how does somebody that is quite so biased as this end up getting a job on the editorial board of a top what's supposed to be a top mainstream media outlet? Because she can't do anything other than bias that newspaper in the future. Now,
that's why she's been hired.
Well, indeed.
That's why she's been hired. And what does that tell you, Mike? That tells you that the atmosphere at that organization is toxic. And it shows you the decrepit state of some of these media institutions. Look at The Guardian. I mean, they've been so consistent putting out all this Russia-phobia, Russiagate, Russian conspiracy theories now also the pro-al-Qaeda leaning moderate rebel narratives with Syria. It must be a toxic atmosphere at this institution. It must be so corrupt because their performance has been so poor for such a long period of time. So it's not just a one-off. These aren't outliers, Mike. This is consistent patterns of behavior from some of these mainstream monolithic ivory towers. So is there a serious problem, institutional problem, with these organizations that's just endemic to the nature of their institutions in this period of time, in this epoch that we're in right now? I think the answer has to be yes. And the same with the New York Times, Mike. It was toxic in a different way during the Bush administration when they were cranking out neoconservative propaganda like crazy in order to back the latest war effort. So it's just the toxicity has changed a little bit, but it's really it's not a good state.
No. Well, let's move north to Canada then. And Canada in the last few days has been criticizing Saudi Arabia for its treatment of women and its human rights record. And Saudi Arabia seems to have taken, is it unfair to say this is an unprecedented step of freezing trade ties, recalling its diplomatic staff from Canada. Is this the first time Saudi Arabia has taken this type of stand whenever criticized by a Western nation?
I believe, Mike, this is the first. It's not the first time that they've taken this stance, but I think this is the first time that a Western country has had their diplomats shown the exit in like such a short period of time. Notice, by the way, how the BBC is using the story to give free advertising for the Democrats, or the Paddy Power's favorite for the Democratic candidate for 2020, which is Michelle Obama, and of course the rehabilitation of Hillary Clinton. There, they getting some free marketing. So
yes. What's the relationship between Saudi Arabia, Canada, and these two?
It's meant to be a human rights person. They're championing there in the middle of that photograph from Saudi Arabia, a woman. And so anyway, so what's going on here, Mike, is serious. If this goes down, in other words, if this precedent is set, this is the beginning. I'm telling you, my opinion. This is the beginning of the end of Saudi Arabia as we know it. Okay, if they're allowed to go down this route, it's going to give an automatic excuse to many parties worldwide, and people in powerful positions that are just waiting for the right opportunity to topple the royal family dynasty in that country who've been running the theocracy, and replace it with something else, basically. And maybe loot the country while they're at it.
Would that be a bad thing?
Well, it depends on who you ask, Mike, but what would be bad would be the chaos that ensues in the meantime. Most likely, if the U.S. was, say, to pull out, theoretically, of this area and then let the Saudis and the Iranians go at it and then walk in like knights on a white horse to pick up the pieces, that's certainly a scenario that could happen down the road. But what I'm saying is Saudi Arabia is, by showing this hand, and they're setting themselves up, Mike, for their own future demise, and then that's just going to be a feeding frenzy. So that's my feeling with this. It's not a good sign.
Okay, well, let's come back to the UK then. Well, the Centre for Cities is pushing out an article about the use of data in smart cities in the UK. Now, of course, everyone concerned about the use of data by Google or Facebook. That seems to be everybody's main focus at the moment. Which, what's the effect of that? Well, mainly used for targeted advertising. But some are concerned that Google, Facebook sharing browsing habits with governments, that people are being tracked across the internet and so on. But this perhaps suggests that that's the least of our worries, because what this article is talking about from the Centre of Cities is a think tank promoting the idea of smart cities and so on, is really highlighting the possibility that the Data Protection Act is probably a bigger threat to our personal information and our privacy than anything that Google or Facebook are doing. What are they talking about? They're talking about making the most of digital connections. That in order to do that, cities have to make better use of data. They've got to share the data they collect with private companies in order to provide better services, Patrick, because of course that's how they justify this. No mention of the Data Protection Act in this. No mention of the European data protection regulations that have come in recently. They're talking about the Ministry of Communities, Housing and Local Government in the last week or so, publishing this article on the left, or this paper on the left. This is the all-party parliamentary group on smart cities. The paper is called Intelligent Leadership. This is basically a local digital declaration aimed at encouraging and supporting local governments to make most of digital technology. They're talking about, as I say, the use of data sharing with private companies in order to, they say, make things much better. We find the usual suspects, the usual NGOs and other think tanks involved in this. On the right-hand side there, we see another paper this time from Nesta, Wise Council, so local authorities, local councils becoming wise by using insights from cutting edge of data-driven local government. So that they're painting this picture of a fantastic, brave new world of getting goods on and off of ships, trains, lorries becoming easier with the introduction of universal container sizes, and therefore by having common data standards across local government, we can make it easier for cities to share, integrate and build upon innovations that rely on digital technology and data. But as I say, no mention of protection of data, no mention of how you make sure that, I mean, they give cursory lip service to data security, but no specifics on what that actually means or how you protect people's data. And I don't see that the Information Commissioner or the office of people that he has working or she has working with her either has the funding or the capability to actually keep track of the speed of change here and just the sheer volume of data that's being collected and the purposes for which it's being used. Nobody's really looking at this in any detail, and it's not surprising because it's progressing without any mainstream media coverage and no critical coverage from the mainstream media on this. Really, most people don't even know that it's going on.
Who's driving it? Who's driving the industry? Well, look at the companies that are involved in data harvesting and data analysis, and then also in the applications, Mike. So the big data is being produced every second, every millisecond. Millions and millions of gigabytes are being produced of big data. And so big data is the new oil. Big data is a commodity, and it's just endlessly being produced. So just imagine a gold mine where there's just gold flowing out of the mine, and all you have to do is scoop it up and then run it through some algorithmic filters and then resell it back to the government or to other corporations. So talk about money for old rope. All to improve the services. What services? I'm not sure. Are you getting any new services, Mike? I haven't seen.
No, we're systematically having our services shut down because of lack of money, allegedly.
But we got new bins. We got new bins after.
Did you?
X amount of years. There's new bins, so there are things happening. I just want to make that known.
But what's actually good? You may have new bins, but the point is they're only being collected once a month now or once every 2 weeks. So what's actually happening is that money is being diverted into this type of program, this transformational program into this brave new world, as they keep calling it. They don't tell us what they're transforming local government into, but in the meantime, in order to provide the money for this nonsense, they are actually cutting back on services that people need today. Now, I have no particular issue with people having a view of what is coming down the road in the future and having an idea of where they want to go in the future. But the point is that idea is never communicated to the general public. Nobody knows what it is. Nobody knows where we're being brought to. And nobody knows what's happening with this money that's being spent on these programs.
So if government's becoming more efficient because of the new technology, Mike, does that mean the cost of government operations should come down, shouldn't it? Because the computers are doing so much of this work so much more efficiently than inefficient humans. Wouldn't that mean the cost of budgets can come down? Maybe council tax could drop as well. What do you think?
Well, you would think that.
That would be a great benefit of the great technocratic revolution, is maybe we pay less, but that's not happening. It's going the other way.
Well, no, because the traditional model is that there's innovation somewhere out in the private sector. That innovation is brought to the public sector and sold to the public sector, and as a done deal. Look, we've developed this system. It's going to provide these cost savings for you, and that therefore your local government procurement is going to become cheaper. That isn't what's happening. What's happening is, as we've been trying to highlight for quite some time now, Patrick, that the private sector and the public sector are collaborating on the development of these systems. So the public sector has suddenly become a mechanism for developing future technologies. And as a result, they are putting public sector money into the development of those future technologies. It's not being presented as a done deal. We are paying for our own demise here.
Are we paying, you paying for data? How much?
For the data harvesting?
Are we paying for that?
Of course we are.
How much are we paying each month for data? That'd be a good question to find out. If anybody's out there, there's lots of things, fun projects that you can get involved in at the UK column. So we're just going to throw that out there.
Okay, well, look, we're right out of time, so we will leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us today, Patrick. We will be back at the same time tomorrow. Brian will be back in the studio. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you then. Bye-bye.